Hey guys, welcome back. This is Blue Forest. So today we're going to go over Masteries. I have continued to get questions about them. I did do a Masteries video about 6 months ago when I first started posting to this channel, but in recent months I have unlocked and experimented with some new Masteries that I had not used before, and I've also spoken to a few people who use a few of the more obscure Masteries that people rarely use. So I do have some updated thoughts on Masteries in general, and so I'm going to look at this as my sort of definitive guide to Masteries. We'll go over all of them with some updated thoughts, and that should hopefully help you out if you have any questions about Masteries or if you are looking to make some changes to your setup. So we will start on the defensive side. I'm currently using a very offensive setup, but it should be obvious to say don't copy somebody else's setup. Don't have a mastery setup that somebody else tells you to do. You do need to do what's best for you. Now, as I've said before, my general thoughts are the same, meaning that you want to put the majority of your points into masteries that will benefit all of your bots in all fights first, and then move on to masteries that will benefit certain bots in certain kinds of fights. So on the defensive side, people will say, defense is useless, it doesn't really do much, it's not helpful. That's not entirely accurate, that's a bit simplistic, but it is true that generally offensive masteries will be more beneficial, especially once you're a good enough player that you're not getting hit too often. But there are some defensive masteries that can be helpful to people in some circumstances. So starting with this tree on the left, we'll go through this part quickly, right? So you need to use 10 points in this left tree here if you want to unlock masteries on the right. Health, as you probably know, put 1 point into it, gives you 2% additional health plus 70. You don't need to bother ranking it up because you're only getting an extra 70 health per rank, and for a typical rank 5, rank 6 bot, that is a tiny amount of health. Absolutely not worth it to do so. Armor, same thing. Increases your armor rating, helps you to survive a little bit longer. People will usually use 1 point in this if they use this mastery at all. Full metal is one that I have used on and off. It's decent when your bots are above 85% health. If you rank it up, you have an armor buff that reduces damage by 10%. It's good for things like high level AMs, especially with healing bots like Tronus or Wheeljack, because if you fall below 85% but then go back above it, full metal will reactivate, so it gives you a little bit of protection. These three in the middle here, resist melee and resist ranged and energy resistance. These are examples of defensive masteries that are not very helpful just because the mitigation of damage is very minimal, right? So even if you ranked up resist melee, it's only 5% resistance, so if you ended up getting hit with a combo by a tough opponent, you're still taking 95% of the original damage. I do know people that have used resist ranged and or energy resistance with bots like Motormaster or Tantrum because you are usually playing very aggressive, you're dashing a lot, you're using that unstoppable. It can help to mitigate range damage that they throw your way. Soundwave can benefit from energy resistance just because he has a lot of that already baked into his shield, so the mastery gives him more. But for most people, you're not going to want to bother with these, and if you do, at most, you'd want to put 1 point into them. The same thing is true with crit resistance. Even if you max this out, you are going to max out at 4.5% resistance, which means that the opponents would crit on you only a little bit less. With that said, though, crit damage resistance is decent, so you get up to 15% less crit damage taken when you eat a critical hit. People who do use this tree, if they're going to use masteries on the right, will often focus on things like full metal or crit damage resistance because they generally will provide the most benefit to your bots overall if you're going to go that route. On the right tree, nano repair, I have experimented with this. We've talked about this. It's just too limited, right? It's going to benefit Wheeljack if you are a heavy Wheeljack user, but it doesn't benefit any other bot at all because it maxes out at a very low amount of health. 400 health is only 1 to 2% of a typical ranked up bot, and you do need to be focusing on ranked up 5 stars because even if you don't have that kind of roster right now, that is going to be your goal over the long run. So if Nano Repair was different, if you recovered more health, if it was actually meaningful, this might be a decent mastery. But you're only going to want to use this either to unlock it to use other masteries, or if you're using Wheeljack religiously. There are people that use Nano Repair for D100 AMs with Wheeljack, but even then, you have to remember it's only up to a minute, right? So it will extend the duration of those shields of his for 60 seconds, but then it's over. So even in long fights, it'll help you out for a bit, but then you're not going to have that benefit come back. So I would be very careful about using Nano unless you are all in on Wheeljack and use him all the time. So willpower and the resistances. So if you've seen my recent videos, I did rank up willpower. I've been curious about it. Overall, it's okay. I do like it. I just wish that it also maxed out at a higher level. This is the problem with a lot of the defensive masteries. They just don't help that much, and willpower is no different. So if you max this out, you are going to recover 9% of the damage that you deal to the opponent when you're debuffed. There's a few things to remember about that though, right? You have to land attacks when you're under the effects of things like bleed or shock. And a lot of debuffs are short, maybe 3 seconds, 4 seconds. You're not always going to be able to land attacks during those windows. And even when you do, they're often going to be melee combos, ranged attacks. And the thing is you're only going to heal meaningfully if you're able to land really big hits when you're debuffed, which you will on occasion, but that's usually not going to be the case. And so it's best to think of willpower as more of a resistance against DOT than a healing mastery, because generally speaking, you're going to be healing maybe 1% to 2% at a time. It helps you out a little bit. It prevents you from eating as much damage as you would, as much DOT damage. But the vast majority of the time, you're not going to heal significantly, because compared to something like MV1's willpower at rank 6, he's recovering 35% of the damage he does. That's 4 times as much as this. Even Nemesis, who has a similar mechanism with his specials, a low sig Nemesis will recover 16 to 18%. That's double what willpower does. So if these amounts were higher, this would be better. As it is okay. It's decent. It's just not really a game changer. And remember, this does take tier 2 mastery cores. It's a lot of energon, and it's a lot of points. With that said, I did test it out with bleed resistance, and I liked them together. I think they're better if they go together, willpower and bleed resistance, because there are more bleed bots than any other DOT bots in the game. There are also bleed mods sometimes. And, with bleed resistance, you're taking less bleed damage. You combine that with willpower. It can help you out if you struggle against DOT bots. But again, it's just a lot of points. I'm not using these long term because you end up using about half your mastery points just to max these out, right? So with that said, though, willpower and bleed resistance is a decent combination, and it can be helpful in certain kinds of fights. So Feeding Frenzy, you don't have to bother with this. You're recovering health against sharks. If you struggle in things like time slides, because there's no sharks and AMs right now, there are far better masteries to invest your time and your points into. The other resistances, you have silica plating, which is essentially burn resistance. I wouldn't bother with this because there's not very many burn bots in the game. And shock resistance could be useful. Unfortunately, though, you need tier 2 cores versus the tier 1 cores that you use for bleed resistance, and it scales differently. It starts at 5% resistance at rank 1, which is effectively nothing. You'd have to spend, again, a lot of energon to rank it up, and you would want to rank it up if you actually wanted to really benefit from it. These two in the corner here, I feel the same about. So Capacitor, when you take shock damage, you generate a little bit of power, but even if you rank this up, you're generating 1.3% power for standard DOT shock damage and 7.5% for instant shock damage. Both of those numbers are incredibly low, pretty useless. That's a fraction of a power bar, not going to be useful, and it only activates when you take shock damage. It's a similar sort of low threshold for Inhibitor. When you land stun or shock on the opponent, their power rate will be reduced when they are stunned or shocked. But even if you rank this up, on the stun side, it's decent, right? So if you rank this up, the opponents will generate 66% less power when they're stunned. But for shock, it's only 10% less power, which is not very helpful. It wouldn't make much of a difference. And stuns, that can be helpful, but stuns are also usually very brief, so this might be good for a bot like Ramjet, who lands long stuns very frequently, But for most stuns that are often, 1-2 seconds, having a reduced power rate for 2 seconds at most is not really going to benefit you. So both capacitor and inhibitor I don't find to be very helpful at all. It seems like largely a waste of points. And then coming down to this tree on the bottom, we have enhanced block. I did use this when I was a newer player. And even now, because I play with one hand, I do block a little bit more than average. It's okay, but the thing is, it maxes out at only 14% block proficiency, which is similar to the proficiency that Galvatron or TC get. Not really going to be worth it for most people, even if you do block relatively frequently, because you're not taking that much less damage. There are people, however, who will use Jetfire with this mastery because he's relying a lot on his parries, he's blocking very often. If you are a die-hard Jetfire user, you could benefit from this, but most people, most bots, would only see a very minor benefit to using this mastery. And recalibration is, I think, one of the most useless masteries in the game. It doesn't make any sense. Basically, it just shortens the duration of stuns when you are stunned, but you have to be stunned multiple times in order to activate it, right? So you get stunned once, and then if you're stunned again, it reduces the duration of subsequent stuns up to a maximum of 55%. So not only do you have to get stunned more than once, which, really experienced players are not usually going to be getting stunned over and over again, but it doesn't negate stuns, it doesn't make you immune to stun, it simply reduces the duration of them. You're still going to be stunned. So this is really a waste of points. They would need to totally rework this in order to make this viable for most people. And then we have these two more here. We have Last Stand. This one also could be okay, but it also suffers from a very low threshold. So when your bots are at low health, their block is no longer broken by enemy heavies. So it's similar to the mechanism that TC has, where his block will not be broken by ground heavies. This one could be all right. The problem is that even if you rank it up, this is only going to activate when your bots are below 14% health. So you're going to be almost dead. And the thing is if you're at 10% health or 8% health and you're trying to finish a fight, you're going to be doing everything you can to avoid all attacks, including heavies, right? You always are, but you're probably going to be playing especially carefully. So the vast majority of fights, this wouldn't activate at all. And even when it did potentially activate, you wouldn't want to risk coming in the way of a heavy anyway, So it's a very silly mastery. If these amounts were doubled, if this kicked in when your bots were below 30% or something like that, there might be some people who would find this interesting. But as it is, because you have to be at incredibly low health to even have a chance to activate it, it simply doesn't make any sense. And then finally, we have Perfect Block. This is another one that could be okay if it wasn't so abysmally low in terms of its activation rate. This is the worst RNG activation rate of all masteries or, basically any abilities that bots have. Because with this mastery, you have a 2 to 8% chance to reduce all incoming damage to 0 when you block. That chance is halved, though, against special attacks, which means even if you rank it up, you'd have an 8% chance to take no damage when you block, but that would only be 4% when you block specials. So if you got stuck, you had to block a special, you'd have a 4% chance at most to take 0 damage, which means this would almost never activate. Even if you block a lot, you would very rarely see this activate. So it's such a low chance. It's a ridiculously low chance. I cannot imagine anyone wanting to waste up to 4 points into a mastery that would almost never benefit them. So this is another one that would need to be significantly reworked in order to make it viable. So that's the defensive side. Like I said, most experienced players aren't going to use a lot of defensive masteries. If they do, they may use Nano if they're using Wheeljack all the time, possibly Willpower. Most of these other ones will benefit maybe 1 or 2 specific bots like Jetfire in specific circumstances, but overall, not that much else. Moving on to the offensive side, so obviously damage, right? You put a point into this, you do not need to rank it up because you're getting a tiny, tiny increase in your attack rating by doing so. Sequencer is very good, right? So you are getting between 3 and 9% additional special damage when you launch specials at the end of combos, which you obviously can do very often in this game. I currently have it at rank 3 just because I'm doing D100 AMs right now, and you have to be very careful in high-level AMs of the opponent's power. You never want to be pushing them up to close to a special 3. So, you're not always able to land full combos before launching specials, but I still have it at rank 3, and I think most people would benefit at having it at rank 3 or 4 because 6 to 9% extra special damage every time you do that will add up. It's a very solid, useful mastery overall. And courage, so this is one that some of the ninjas don't really like. I mean, if you're an absolutely brilliant player and you almost never get hit, you wouldn't really need this because it only activates when you drop below 50%. But for most players, for the average player, and even for experienced players that are doing the most difficult content, you can derive a lot of benefit from this, even though it's not going to activate in every fight, because you're getting up to 17.5% attack when you drop below 50%. That amount doubles when you drop below 10%. So if you're either really good or you're not doing the most difficult content, I would still put a few points into this because everybody messes up. Everybody gets into trouble sometimes. If you're doing really high-level content or you struggle, very worth ranking this up because you get a very sizable and noticeable attack boost whenever you're below 50% health in any fight. Now, Pierce Armor, this one most people will put 1 point into in order to unlock the crit masteries. There are people who rank this up and use this for the left side of AMs because you have a lot of tanky bots, a lot of armor bots, and this allows you to ignore a portion of the opponent's armor with your crits. It's kind of like an armor-piercing mastery in that sense. So you could benefit from it if you're running left side AMs all the time. Otherwise, though, a point or two will be perfectly fine for most people. And then with the crit masteries, we have crit rate. I've been up and down on this for a long time. I do like it overall. I mean, some people criticize this because obviously your crit rate is not increasing that much. It only goes up by a maximum of 4.5%. But it's best to think of this one as an accumulative mastery, right? Because if you play this game regularly, right, you're doing hundreds and then thousands and thousands of hits over time. So if you're getting an extra 3, 4, or 5 hits that are crits for every 100 or so, that does add up, right? So it's not the kind of thing that you're going to, see some amazing benefit from necessarily in a single fight, but over time it does accumulate. You do have more crits over time as you're playing. And so that makes it, I think, worthwhile to put at least a few points into. You don't have to max it out, but crits are obviously very important. And, having even a slightly higher crit rate is always going to be beneficial to you. Crit damage, this one's one of the most beneficial in the game, in my opinion. It's kind of a no-brainer. You're getting up to 15% additional crit damage whenever you crit, and that's always a good thing. So I generally would recommend to max this out, at least put a few points into it because extra crit damage is just going to lead to bigger specials, bigger hits, bigger everything, So it's an excellent, just a very no-brainer type mastery for most people. Sniper's pretty good. I think it's worth putting a point into. There are people who will max this out if they are focusing a lot on range-based fighters, right? So if you use bots like RC, Blaster, Starscream, Wasp, Shockwave, bots that have a lot of ranged built into their game, you could really benefit from pouring a bunch of points into this because you're getting up to 8 to 16% additional damage on your basic range shots depending on distance, right? So this is another one that's kind of accumulative, right? Because you're obviously firing off a lot of basic range shots in fights, even if you're not using the range-based fighters. So it'll be a little bit of damage every time. It's not going to, give you monster boosts of damage, but it will add up. It's a little bit of damage, a little bit of damage, a little bit of damage, which over time will help you out. So, even if you're not a range-based fighter, I think it's very worth a point just because you're going to get a little bit of extra range damage, and the farther you are away from the opponent, the bigger that boost is going to be. And then finally in this tree, we have Counterpunch and Gunslinger. So they work in the same way. Counterpunch, whenever you sidestep a dash or a melee special. You attack within a few seconds and you get an attack boost on your next hit. And Gunslinger, same thing. You sidestep a projectile, you attack, and then you get an extra attack boost on your next attack. I have tested these both out, and some people really like those. Some people think they're kind of useless. They're not useless. These are both, Counterpunch and Gunslinger are both also accumulative masteries, right? Because the attack boost that you're going to get is not huge. It'll be up to 15 to 18%. And it is only on your next attack, right? It's not for a time duration. It's not for 5 seconds. Your next attack is usually going to be something like a melee combo or a few range shots. So it's not like you're going to get these massive boosts of damage. However, both Counterpunch and Gunslinger will activate very often because you're very frequently evading, dodging, and then countering. You do it all the time in this game. And so in a typical fight, either of these masteries will activate multiple times. And in long fights, you could have these activate dozens of times, right? And so that little bit of extra damage that you're getting will add up. There is an absolute accumulative benefit to using either of these or both of these. If you do use either of them, I would take them at least to rank 3 or 4 because it is a very brief time window. You have to do it within a couple seconds. So you'd want to rank it up to get the bigger attack boost, but also to have a couple of seconds just in case you can't counter the split second you dodge or if you're far away from the opponent. But they're good. They're accumulative. You get plenty of use out of them. They activate very frequently. So, there are people that like to use either or both of them, and it will be beneficial to you if you do so. Just don't expect, massive boosts of additional damage when you use them. So that wraps up this tree. It's the same principle as defense, right? You have to use at least 10 points in this tree to move to the right. So Starseeker, this is one that I only recently maxed out. I had it at rank 4 for a long time. I finally spent the energon to max it out. This is an excellent mastery, okay? If you are a good player, right? That's the caveat. You don't have to be the greatest player in the world, but you do have to be able to keep those hit streaks going. But my opinion of Starseeker has only increased over time because the thing about it is that even though you're seeing a maximum boost in attack rating at 100 hits, one misconception that some people still have is that it only activates after 100 hits. That is not true. So Starseeker begins to work. It's a passive, accumulative, exponential mastery that begins to work as soon as you have a few hits in the combo meter. And so even though it's true that a lot of fights in the game are not 100 plus hits, it doesn't really matter because you're going to see a noticeable benefit at 60 hits or 40 hits. It won't be as big of a benefit as at 100 hits, but it does add up. And the thing is if you rank this up, which most experienced players in the game do, getting up to 80% attack at 100 hits is significant. It's huge, and it's very noticeable. And so that's why, even though, like I said, you're not always going to have 100-hit fights, the majority of fights are not that long, even in fights that are mid-length, where maybe they're 50 or 60 hits. If you are good enough and you're not getting hit that much, and you're able to keep that combo meter going, you will see real and noticeable changes in your damage by using this. And it's also kind of motivating because you're rewarded for not being hit. So you're encouraged to want to rack up that combo meter, which is always a good thing in this game, Now, obviously, the downside is that as soon as you get hit, you lose it and you have to start over again. But as long as you're not getting hit all the time, you would derive plenty of benefit from this. And if you are going to use this, I would max it out or at least take it to rank 4 because getting 60 to 80% extra attack potentially is a lot better than 24% or 35%. It's a very good mastery, one of the most widely used among higher level players. Glass Cannon, I did not always use this one myself, but I have in the last 6 months a lot more. I think it's very, very good. It's a trade-off, but you're getting up to 7.2% attack in exchange for 7.2% less health if you rank it up. If you're a good player, again, if you're experienced, you won't mind sacrificing a little bit of health in exchange for some extra attack, and it applies to all of your bots in every fight. So, whether you put 1 point into it or 3, it's very worthwhile if you're a good player, you're not getting hit constantly, and you don't mind losing a little bit of health. So, Double Edge, this is a circumstantial mastery for sure. I did test this out. I took it to rank 2 right after I started using Willpower and Bleed Resistance, because those two work very well with this mastery, right? So with Double Edge, you're gaining up to 18% attack when it's maxed out in exchange for up to 27% lost health from bleed damage, right? Now that is a lot. So there's only 2 circumstances in which you're generally going to want to use Double Edge. The first is if you are using Willpower, preferably with Bleed Resistance, because if you do that, you'll take less damage from the Double Edge bleed damage. And if you are able to land hits at the start of the fight, with Willpower, you'll be able to recover back some of that bleed damage as well. The other circumstance in which you might want to use Double Edge is if you use Purifiers constantly. So if bots like Grim, TC, or Beast Wars teams are your top bots, you're using them really frequently, those are great for Double Edge because you can purify the instant the fight begins, you don't lose any of your health to bleeds, and you get that attack boost. For most other people, though, it's not really going to be worth your while because if you're not using Willpower and Bleed Resistance and you're not using Purifiers a lot, you're going to be losing a lot of health to bleeds. I mean, if you're an absolute ninja-like player and you don't really care about that, you might get away with it, but most players are not going to find it worthwhile, especially because it maxes out at 18% attack, which is a nice boost, but there are other masteries that can give you more. There are other ways to get those kinds of attack boosts without having to sacrifice a bunch of health to bleeds. So I did enjoy experimenting with it, but I feel like unless I was using Willpower and Bleed Resistance long term, it wouldn't be right for me. But it could be worthwhile, like I said, if you're using Purifiers really frequently, in the majority of the fights that you do. And then on this tree, the final one here is Unfazed. So I have used this on and off as well. I do like it overall. It's not the greatest, but it is good. It's a bit of what you might call evade resistance, right? So it's not anti-evade, but it does help you against evade bots. Now, I run the right side in AMs where there's lots of evade lanes. This would also be very helpful against evade lanes in time slides. So with this one, the main caveat about Unfazed is that you really have to max it out. You want it at least at rank 4. Anything below that, it's random, it's unpredictable, it rarely triggers, it doesn't really help. If you have it maxed out, though, you have a 50% chance to become unstoppable every time an opponent evades, and obviously a lot of evade bots and evade mods evade all the time. So you will get a lot of use out of this if you max it out, and if you're running, let's say, right side AMs. You do also get 85% extra attack on your next hit. Now that's a lot, but remember, it's only your next hit. And your next hit is usually going to be a melee, a range shot. You might get lucky and land a special or a heavy, and you'll get a nice boost in damage. Most of the time, though, it's not going to be that. However, it's really the defensive side of it that's better. It's that unstoppable, right? Because when you're going up against an evade bot, they often evade frequently and randomly. And when they do, they almost always want to counter you. And so with Unfazed, when the Unstoppable activates, it just gives you that 1 second to get out of the way and avoid that counter. And it can save you, which especially in high-level AMs, if you get countered by Scout B or Sideswipe or something, they can kill you quickly, So it does give you some defensive protection, and then you have that nice attack boost whenever you are able to land pretty good hits afterwards. So if you run right side AMs, or if you struggle with evade bots in general, or if you don't have any anti-evade bots maxed out, like if you don't use Drift or Hot Rod, bots like that, then this would be worth your while, right? If not, if you're not running right side AMs, or you don't really mind just dealing with evade lanes, or like I said, if you have anti-evade bots in your arsenal, you wouldn't really need to bother with this. So it's a good mastery, but it really needs to be ranked up. I mean, rank 4 minimum, preferably rank 5. So coming down to this tree here, Assassin, I'm a fan of Assassin. It doesn't really need to be maxed out, but it's helpful because whenever the opponent is below 18% health, you're getting up to 40% attack. You also decrease the opponent's defensive ability trigger rate by 25%, so that's things like armor buffs triggering. And if the enemies start the fight below 18%, you also gain 30% offensive ability trigger rate, right? Now, this is a very good one for high-level players and difficult fights, because in tough fights where the opponents hit very hard and where the fights tend to be longer, by the time the opponent drops below 18% health, the fight is not yet almost over, right? In short fights, the fight is almost over. So you don't really need Assassin for short, easy fights. But in long fights, the opponent can still do a lot of damage to you if they're at 15 or 10% health. And so getting that significant attack boost really does help. You notice it. A lot of times those last several hits that you land are really strong, really good. It just helps you to finish the fight faster. It can also be very helpful if you are in trouble as well. If you're playing in high-level AMs, you're at low health, the opponent's at low health, it just gives you some extra protection. So if you're doing really difficult content, I would take this at least to rank 4, if not rank 5. It's very worthwhile. And remember, this will activate for every single fight in the game. You won't always need it, but it will activate in every fight whenever the opponent drops below 18%. And even if you're not doing really high-level content, even taking it to rank 2 or 3, very worthwhile. You're still getting that 20 to 25% extra attack. It's a good mastery, and like I said, it will trigger in every single fight with every single bot. And so finally, that brings us to our final tree here. We have Despair. So every debuff you have on the opponent will reduce their healing and repair effects by 5 to 20%. Can be useful for repair bots, repair mods, etc., etc. Most people will just use this at rank 1 to unlock deep wounds. There are certain circumstances in which you may want to max this out, but most people will do just fine to have Despair at rank 1. And then, of course, deep wounds. This is an excellent mastery if you use bleed bots. I'm a big fan of deep wounds. I always have been. I use it all the time, depending on what my teams are looking like. So right now, I'm not using bleed bots a whole lot, so I have it at rank 2. But if I am using bleed bots more often, I'll often have it at rank 4 or 5, because it increases the duration of bleeds by 10 to 30%. That can add seconds to your bleeds, and that adds up. Additionally, if you have more health than the opponent, you will instantly knock down between 0.6 and 1.4% health from them every time you land a bleed. This is really useful. You don't have to max it out because it rises by the same amount per level, right? It's 5% per rank. So it doesn't get a really big boost at rank 4 or 5, which is kind of nice, which means that you can see the benefit of this even at, let's say, rank 2 or 3. It's very noticeable at rank 4 or 5, but even at lower rank, you will get some benefit. Longer bleeds lead to more damage. It also, by the way, can be beneficial for certain abilities, like Cheetor's repair block, right? The repair block is active as long as the opponent is bleeding. Longer bleeds means longer repair block. Same thing with Bone Crusher, right? The power rate down on the opponent and the increased power rate for him, that will last longer with longer bleeds. So if you're using bots like Cheetor, Bone Crusher, Windy, Drift, Necro, MV1, OGP, RC, all of the bots that, Dirge for sure, all the bots that bleed frequently, you're going to get a lot of benefit from this. So I would say that as long as you have at least, let's say, 2 or 3 bleeders in your main squads, I would put at least a couple points into this. If you basically never use bleed bots, you don't have to bother. But if you use a lot of bleed bots, I would max this out. If you use a couple bleed bots, maybe take it to rank 2 or 3. Very good mastery with very noticeable benefits. And then finally, we have these 2 stun masteries. So Suppression will trigger 10 to 45% fewer abilities on opponents when they are stunned, and they will repair between 20 and 90% less when they are stunned. So most people would also only use this at rank 1 in order to unlock Stupefy. This could be decent for a bot like Ramjet because he's stunning a lot. Most other stun bots, you wouldn't really need to bother with this, and also you'd probably want to rank it up, and it's a lot of mastery cores, it's a lot of points. So unless you're a really serious Ramjet user, you wouldn't need to put more than 1 point into Suppression. And then the final mastery here is Stupefy. I have gotten some reviews on this because I am curious to try it out myself. And I've spoken to several people who either have used it or are using it, and I get very good reviews. It is a stun duration mastery. It's really good if you max it out. You have to max it out, because if you do, you get an additional 0.8 seconds per stun. At low rank, zero 0.1, 0.2 seconds is barely noticeable. That's not going to help you. So you'd have to be willing to take it to rank 5. But if you are, it would be beneficial for bots, particularly with shorter stuns. I know people that will specifically use Stupefy for Jetfire because he's landing those 1 second stuns with his parry. Bots like Windblade, Jazz, Prowl, Ratchet, Soundwave, Bludgeon, a lot of bots that have, 1 to 2 second stuns on certain attacks will get a lot of benefit from this. A bot like Ramjet, who already has 3 or 4 second stuns, he wouldn't really need this. But bots that have shorter stuns that can be applied pretty frequently, you're going to get real benefit from using Stupefy because, a 1.5 second stun, sometimes that's not a big enough window to launch an extra attack. So if you had an extra 0.8 seconds, nearly an extra second, that would absolutely help you out sometimes. So I do plan to test this out eventually, and I have heard good things about it. So on the offensive side, most people on this left tree, they're going to focus points on things like Sequencer, Courage, crit damage for sure, Starseeker and Glass Cannon if you are a good experienced player, Unfazed for evade lanes and evade bots, Assassin for high level play in particular, Deep Wounds for bleed bots, and Stupefy for stun bots. And so that kind of wraps up this, new final edition of the Masteries video. And I just want to reiterate, don't listen to what other people tell you. Don't just copy somebody else's setup. But more importantly, be willing to experiment, right? Now, I understand that Masteries that require tier 2 cores, it's a lot of Energon. You don't want to blow thousands of Energon to use Masteries that you might not actually benefit from. But Masteries that don't require cores, or Masteries that only require the tier 1 cores that are a lot cheaper, if you have certain bots or certain teams that you think might benefit, it is worth it to try them out because sometimes they will surprise you. And remember, your teams will change over time, right? So you may not be using a bot that benefits from X or Y mastery now, but maybe a little bit later you will be, so maybe you have found that you have certain bots that will benefit from this mastery or that mastery that would not have been the case, last year or something like that. So it's a really good thing to at least review your masteries again, because a lot of people do end up allocating all their mastery points and then just leaving them alone for years even. It's easy to just kind of forget about them. But I think it's very worthwhile to at least take a look at them, possibly do a reallocation, and possibly try a few new ones. Once, like I said, you have the core masteries, ranked up and everything, you may have a few masteries here and there that will benefit certain bots and which will end up really impressing you and helping you out. So I will leave it there for now, guys. Do let me know if you have any questions. Until we speak again, take care of yourselves, and we will be in touch soon.